So the next question that we had is, how have your cultural identities been impacted or impact others when engaging community? But even though that's what's in front of you, I'm gonna change things for a second. Hope that's okay. You all kind of tapped into this question of why you care about communities and why you're engaging in different things, and how your stories play into that. It's a little bit in your poems, it's a little bit in what you said, but I just want to see if you could take a moment and kind of, I'll give you a second to think about it too, or if somebody wants to jump in while you look ready to jump. But if you're ready to share on that, and just really think about sort of at your core, why are you doing this, and how do your identities play into why you do what you do?
I can jump. I'm a mom. And it is growing increasingly difficult to go to sleep at night thinking about the world that my 3 young adult children have to navigate. They're mixed race. And so I do the work because I want the world that they inherit to be different and to be kinder and to be more just. And it's all about them for me. It's about them and their friends and their peers, and so it's about the next generation.
Okay, I'll jump too. Well, building on what I shared with you earlier about growing up in an immigrant family, very much alone in Omaha, Nebraska, that assimilation culture was something that I had to figure out over time, because, you know, I look back on my parents who, and my first language was Thai, and they didn't realize that I didn't really actually know English until I went to preschool, and my teacher let them know that. So I lost Thai because they immediately kicked into speaking only English at home to me. And I think that's a story that is not unusual, not uncommon among immigrant families. But there's a certain sense of loss in that loss of culture and identity. And I feel like some of my work is to, and the work with my children as well, is to overcome that story of assimilation and to rewrite it. And it's not to erase what my parents did, because my parents were survivors. They were doing that because they wanted us to be okay in this home that they had created for us. So I don't fault them for it, but, you know, for example, they had us baptized Catholic and they were Buddhists. You know, they would take us to church and stand, you know, sit while we were kneeling and stuff like that. And so, you know, just the amount of work that they did to make sure we would fit in was enormous. And I don't fault them for it, but I feel like my work now is to reclaim some of what we collectively lost as a family and as a community in that process. And so that sense of wanting to be visible and to be seen as who we are historically as well as right now is with me in my work as well, because I can notice, right, I want to see other people more fully because I know what it's like not to be seen so fully.
I'll just chime in and say, nailed it. Really very similar experience. Just reiterating something that I tried to say in that first round, but you know, I wrote it down. Empathy is a learned skill. I think it's instilled in a life of assimilation and adaptation. And so I'm not saying that I'm working towards getting away from empathy. I'm just saying that when you have a life that is kind of forced to assimilate and adapt, you are forced to learn to empathize and to put yourself in other people's experiences. And that's been a life's work for me. And I think that's a shared experience for a lot of people. And I think it's not an experience that people in dominant communities go through. And so in some, and oftentimes I get into moments where I think in many cases, there is a lack of empathy and a lack of skill building in empathy in certain communities. And that's my hope, is that empathy is actually something that is a skill that's really shared across many of us, and not just based on people being forced into assimilating, adapting, and kind of pivoting for people with certain identities, certain perspectives, having to really, adjust. And I do believe and feel sacrifice in order to feel like they can operate in their societies and operate in their just general lives. And I think it's beyond operate, actually. I want to say that this comes down to feelings that cause health disparities, societal issues, mental health, security, finance. I mean, literally, livelihood is basically what it comes down to. And so alleviating that, I share again, is worth it, to alleviate that for a bit myself, selfish reasons, to feel like I have pride in the work that I do, in the connections that I make, but also to hopefully have a little bit of a legacy in that and create change in that.
I appreciate so much how you said that, because in the first round I was kind of trying to struggle with that as someone who's transracial adoptee, raised in southern Indiana with white Christian, I would say to the right, they would say liberal, they're to the right, parents, that assimilation kind of drive was sometimes very blatant, like, don't do this, you don't want people to think that. And sometimes it was very kind of unspoken, under the radar, just like, for example, my brothers and I are all biracial. We were not allowed in the 70s to carry the Afro pick. Everybody know the Afro pick? We weren't allowed to carry that because my parents didn't want folks to have a certain assumption about us, that we were not articulate, that we didn't have manners, that we were thuggy or ghetto or whatever those words are at the time. And so there were certain ways in which we were not allowed to consume culture or have cultural connections that some of our peers did in that direct attempt to assimilate. So that's why I got issues, I see. Thank you for summarizing that.
Yeah.
Thank you all, and I know I can sit here too and hear some of those things, and you put words to a lot of the things that I feel also. And I think one of the themes that came across there is reclamation was one of those pieces, but also the sense of longing and desire to belong, both to the cultures we see around us and to our own cultures and our own history. Thank you for bringing that. I'm going to jump back to the other question that I mentioned before, and you also started getting to this a little bit about how your cultural identities have been impacted or impact others. And you did really talk a bit about impacted by the communities that you're surrounded with, but is there also a way in which your sense of culture and identities are strengthened when you are engaging with communities?
I'll jump in on this one. And I'll add a little bit to the previous question too, just to reinforce this, is that there, with those, with the claiming and owning of identity, and so many identities that I hold, I also push myself to think about the identities that I don't hold, and that I want to understand, and I let myself not know. And I think we can not know, and that can be okay. There's like an opportunity to learn, in moments of not knowing. And I was sharing that, I look to people like Avi to understand a little bit about fatherhood, which I don't know, and I might not know in my lifetime. I can relate in terms of being an uncle and being a son, but I won't know the identity of being a father. And so that's okay to not know. And it's okay to recognize that I won't fully know that. But to have it be an opportunity for learning is a great perspective to be in, and a great opportunity for learning. That's a really kind of relatable identity, and it can get down to something that's even more nuanced. How is somebody who has really similar identities to me, that has darker skin than I do, relate to me and differ from me? What do I not know about their experiences and how they approach the world, or how the world approaches them, based on just the color of their skin, even though they may be another queer Muslim person living in South Minneapolis, right? We should have a lot to share in common, but we also have a real difference in our world views and the way the world views us. Coming back to the impact that has, right now I'm working in a foundation. It's got a lot of power. I'm like sitting into an identity of power through my work. I shared this, and this impacts me, and I impact the community in such different ways. When I first started my job, and I went, with my supervisor, she was training me in, and we just went in really candidly to a due diligence conversation, and we were having this conversation, and she was just like, oh gosh, my kids were puking all over the place this weekend, and we've been running around, and my husband was out doing this and that, and I felt like so jealous of her, because she was able to delve into her real mainstream kind of life with the family and everything in this rural community, with a lot of really white male faces in the room. And I was in a mindset of, don't you dare say anything that's going to make you stand out in this group of people. Because that's where I had been really coming from, my whole existence. And slowly I've been tapping into the power that is in wealth, and in this wealth institution at the Bush Foundation, and coming into those communities and really talking about my partner, talking about being gay, talking about attacks on mosques, talking about my family fasting for Ramadan, in those conversations, to say, this is part of the conversation that you're having with the wealth institution, and I am the voice of that wealth institution. And that similarly in communities where I'm having that conversation with people who I do identify with is just as impactful, to say something like, I'm in. I'm there, what are you working on? What are you doing? I understand some of the core issues that you're working on. I relate to the core issues that you're working on, and the identities and the structures that are influencing the issues you're undergoing and our community is undergoing. What can we do to work together, rather than you needing to really, from the ground up, explain that to me? And so I don't think that first one's a negative. I think they're both positive. I think it's pushing people to think differently, and it's also creating some sort of comfort with some communities as well. I'll stop.
I would say for me it's also both and. It causes me to push when I need to push, and step away when I need to step away. And it keeps me grounded in why I do the work. I think, and that thing is equity. I've been involved in lots of organizations that are, funded and run and kind of controlled by white cis women doing, managing the work for, HIV in men's community, for men who have sex with men of color. And, having to kind of bring folks along and explain, like, no, that's not how gay brown guys interact with each other, to someone who's supervising me and holding power over me, influences the way in which I show up at a meeting, the way that I advocate for my community when I'm talking to funders or when I'm writing a grant. It's kind of funny that you were talking about the census, because my partner and I stayed up all night literally writing a grant for the 2020 census, and part of our gut struggle with it is how can we as queer brown leaders talk to our peers, our friends, other brown underrepresented folks in the census data pool about how important it is to fill out your thing when we know the history. We know that people have been literally rounded up in this country and imprisoned simply because they filled out something on a census form. We know that is the history of our country. And so talking to our peers about filling out that form, we're having this kind of like internal debate and struggle about how can we do that as leaders. Yes, we need to be visible and have our voice counted. It's how data shows, it's where funding actually comes from. So yes, we must get our people to show up. Yes, we must be a voice in that. And how do you have those authentic, engaging conversations when people's literal residency is at stake, their literal ability to stay here in this country to survive, to begin to thrive? How do you weigh those two things? And so I think it's always in that kind of and space.
That is exactly the conversation we're having, and I think it's a tough one.
It is.
Yeah, I don't know how. I think for us, kind of veering a little bit on the census, but connected, it's thinking about how that thing, that very specific thing, has the possibility of opening up this deeper conversation, and this is connected to identity and culture and engagement, that deeper conversation of what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be a part of a community? What does it mean to be counted? And by counted, I don't mean just, the data on the census, but to be seen and heard and recognized for who you are in the community. So I think there's possibility in it, but it's very, very difficult, given where we are right now. To your question, Avi, I would say that both, I don't know, negative isn't quite the right word, but challenging. Both challenging and positive impacts of bringing cultural identity into our work at Voices. And positive in that I have learned so much. In fact, my own desire to do what I shared earlier, which is to uncover, those stories, uncover that culture, and to really live into that more for myself and for my children, is inspired by working in a very intentional, multiracial, multicultural workspace that is really a movement space, and that where people really are able to show up as they are, as completely who they are in at Voices. And we work really hard to create that, and as somebody working to create it, I'm constantly learning from my colleagues, oh, it's so beautiful. And there's a little bit of me that's envious of what they have. But also it makes me want to have that too, to really build that myself. So it's challenging and positive.
I like what you're saying about belonging. I, for 8 years, volunteered with a youth leadership program that's housed here at Wilder, that's multicultural and diverse, and was a space that created belonging and also held really well this tension between celebrating and recognizing our differences, but also celebrating and recognizing our commonalities. And in that space of both of those, finding belonging. And that's the gift that doing community engagement work across cultures has brought to me, is that if I enter into those spaces with, what did Mother Teresa say something about, that if we enter into space with people with curiosity, there's no room for judgment. And so trying to always remind myself and challenge myself, how can I show up in this space with curiosity and grace so that I don't have room to judge, but have room to understand, and to lift up other people's stories and to help people learn from each other as well. And that's hard because we live in a society that has been driven by capitalism and hyper-individualism, and it's a fight. It's an upstream fight, right? To get people to let go of some of that or realize some of that and figure out how we can be better neighbors despite our differences, because of our differences. Yeah, every day it's hard. It's hard work and it's hard.